Greetings, my illustrious chess friends, and 1,000 salams to you. And we will continue our series on beginner strategy, or chess strategy for beginners rather, looking at isolated pawns. Now let us define the concept first. An isolated pawn is simply a pawn that has no other adjacent pawns to it. And you can see in the case of black, he has 3 isolated pawns, and there are no adjacent pawns to these pawns. Now, in this instance, the pawns are particularly weak, simply because they cannot defend each other. And the result of that is, in strategic terms, is that pieces that would much rather be doing something more important get sucked in to defending these weaknesses. And if you contrast that with white's position, who has 3 connected pawns, even when they are under attack, they are somehow able to support each other. Now, another weakness of an isolated pawn is the fact that the square in front of the pawn can be used as an enemy as an excellent base for his light and heavy pieces. And you can see that in the dynamics of this position here. White has an isolated pawn on c4, and the square in front of this pawn, c5, is an excellent place for a light piece. And the reason for that is that because there are no pawns on the b and c file, this point on c5 can never really be challenged by a pawn. And therefore it becomes, as a rule, a very important strategic point. Now, we make a distinction, my chess friends, between an isolated pawn in the centre, in this instance on d5, than an isolated pawn in some other part of the board. Because even though both types of isolated pawns have in common that their weakness becomes more pronounced when the number of the pieces on the board diminish, a central isolated pawn does not always entail a drawback for the side which possesses it. But it even has a number of pluses which might manifest itself particularly during the middle game. And you can see in this instance that this isolated pawn on d5, it supports a knight here on e4. And this means that black is able to influence the game in certain ways. It also gives him a spatial plus in the centre. White has no pawns in the centre here, as you can see. And the possession of this pawn means, of course, a semi-open file for use. But we'll talk about more of these concepts in other videos when we get to that stage. But the central isolated pawn, suffice to say, is not always bad, and in fact can confer upon its owner certain advantages. In this instance, a place for a minor piece, space in the centre, and a half-open file to work with. However, if you are playing against someone with an isolated pawn, there are basic methods that you can employ, and essentially what you want to do is simplify the position, because with less pieces on the board, then the more pronounced the weakness of the isolated pawn becomes. And we can do this by means of exchanges. We can then blockade the isolated pawn, and we can put pressure on it by light and heavy pieces. Now these latter two principles of blockading the pawn and putting pressure on the pawn by light and heavy pieces are simply based on the idea that a target that cannot move is much easier to hit than a moving target. And this means that the square in front of the isolated pawn, in this instance d4, is of critical strategic importance. Now you can see in this position, chess friends, that black has an isolated pawn on c6. And white is putting pressure on it with heavy and light pieces. But in addition to that, you can see that white is controlling this critical square in front of it, the square c5, with a pawn, knight, queen and a rook. And what has in fact transpired is that this pawn at c6 is now absolutely immobile. It simply cannot move forward. And it's a much easier target for white to pressurize and eventually capture because it's stationary. So what we're going to do now is look at some of these methods that we have talked about and how they are applied by chess masters. Okay, let's check out our game now. With the white pieces is famous world champion from Armenia, Tigran Petrosian, and with the black pieces is equally famous world champion Mikhail Botvinnik from Russia. So we're not going to concern ourselves too much with the opening. Suffice to say is that what happens is that black has a single weakness, an isolated pawn. And what white does is he uses the squares in front of the isolated pawn with excellent effect. And Petrosian himself, he writes in his notes to this game, he writes that it was quite difficult for white to actually capture the isolated pawn. But the weakness was not only in the pawn's isolation, but in the fact that white's pieces, because they were lodged in front of the pawn, were somewhat immune from attack. And this game is a wonderful example of how to utilize weak squares in front of an isolated pawn. So let's check it out. Begins English and essentially ends up a Grunfeld, and here's Grunfeld. But we'll simply go forward to the point, and it's essentially here where black plays this dubious move e6, and it results in the creation of a weakness, a weak isolated pawn on e6. After pawn takes, queens are exchanged, bishop takes, and then bishop takes, and here we have the isolated pawn on e6. Essentially black's only weakness. Now you can see it's not on an open file, there is no semi-open file here, but what is useful to white is the squares in front of this isolated pawn, simply put because they can never be challenged or driven away by another pawn. And check out the way Petrosian takes advantage of this positional feature. King e2, rooks are exchanged, and here Petrosian plays the excellent knight to g5. And the idea of this is that not only does it attack the weakness on e6, but he's preparing to bring his knight to one of the squares in front of the isolated pawn, in this instance the e4 square. And here it is, the knight comes to e4. Knights are exchanged, but another knight simply takes its place. Rook to b1. And here Botvinnik's idea is simply he's going to bring his knight to d5 and then to f6 and try and exchange off this knight here on e4. Because he realizes it's almost immune from attack here. Bishop d2. Botvinnik carries out his idea. And here Petrosian plays the excellent a4. And he's beginning a minority attack against this structure of black, these pawns here. And he will try and create some other type of pawn weakness. Excellent. b5. Almost forcing some type of concession from black. And in this instance, what Botvinnik does is he advances the pawn, but the result of it is that the pawn becomes virtually isolated. And I say virtually because you'll see after the move c4, Petrosian plays the excellent b5. And you can see how, although not literally isolated, because there are of course other pawns which could be beside it, but it's in effect, it's virtually isolated. And it's very instructive the way how Petrosian goes around taking advantage of this. He was truly a positional master. King f7. Bishop c3, immediately blockading the pawn. And of course we've discussed that earlier. Bishop a3, rook c2, knight takes, rook takes, bishop b4, rook goes back, knight d2, forcing the pawn to advance. And this pawn here on c3 is not much longer for this world, because what will transpire is that because it has advanced so far into white's territory, being virtually isolated, the king will now come in with decisive effect. Knight e4, and nothing can stop the king from coming in. Rook d8, knight, king c4, rook d1, and of course the pawn is lost. And here Petrosian simply gives back the pawn, the h-pawn, but in compensation he strengthens his position in the centre. Rook takes h2, king d4, king d7, g3, bishop b4, and the excellent king e5. And look how these two pieces of white have made use of the two squares in front of this isolated pawn. It's amazing, it really is. Positionally beautiful. Rook h5, and the king enters black's position. e5, threatening of course the bishop. It's got to move. Check. Threatening it again. Pinning it. And after this move, king g8, black in fact resigned, because these pawns here are very weak, and if this pawn advances, of course this pawn will be lost. So, a fantastic positional game from Tigran Petrosian, beautifully illustrating how to take advantage of weak isolated pawns by making use of the squares in front of them and by putting pressure on them. And my dear chess friends, I do hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed relating it to you. And we're almost finished our series on pawns. And it's with some sadness that I say that, because I really, really love looking at pawns and pawn structure. I know it's not to everybody's taste. They would sometimes rather see exciting blitz games or chess traps or beautiful combinations. But anyhow, there you go. There you have it. Anyhow, suffice to say, I'll simply leave you and sincerely wish you well with your own chess.